Thank you very much, Geoffrey. That was an interesting talk, some interesting insights, and the perfect segue to what I'm going to be talking to you about here for the next 30 minutes. And that is how to rethink your path to carbon net zero with IoT. My name again is Tor Schuler. I'm a Senior Director of Innovation at Avanade. And I am here in Houston running our Innovation Lab and Experience Center. If you have not seen it, I invite you to come out, buy a cup of coffee, and we can chat about carbon net neutrality all day long. I'm currently focusing mostly on IoT, machine learning, digital twins, AI, and blockchain to create solutions that help my clients to progress their path to carbon net zero. So when I talk to my clients, particularly in the energy space, there are really three drivers that underlie all conversations that we have. The first one is the drive towards competitiveness. How can we maximize the value of every molecule that we have across the entire value chain and ruthlessly cut costs while retaining a fabulous product that we're producing? The second, though, is sustainability. A lot of my clients have made commitments towards carbon net zero. Not too far out. You hear about 2035, 2040, 2050. It's around the corner. And a lot of them still grappling on how they're actually going to go about achieving those commitments. And then last but not least, a lot of the conversations revolve around agility and resilience. How do we better deal with shocks to the systems? How do we deal with disruptive events such as COVID, such as supply chain breakdowns, while we keep operations running? How can we constantly de-man operations, increase automation to become more resilient, more agile? Now today, I'm going to be focusing mostly on that second tier, the sustainability tier, as you might have guessed by the title. So if you think about reducing our carbon footprint in oil and gas, the conversation inevitably turns towards methane. Well, why is that? Methane, pound for pound, is, depending on the model that you're using, 28 times more potent than CO2 in terms of its impact on the greenhouse situation. If you actually use the 12.4 year life cycle model, that number actually goes up to 84 times as potent. So that is why, even though methane only makes up about 10% of our emissions by volume, so much focus is given to methane reduction by the industry, because its impact for the 10% by volume is so outsized, times 80. You got to imagine that. So when we talk about sustainability, there are a number of drivers that put sustainability front and center. And it's driven by a number of the stakeholders across the industry. It's driven by regulatory compliance, by people putting forward additional regulation. In the US, we've been not so much hit by that, but it is going to come for sure. Employees are human beings too. They want to leave the world a better place for their kids, for their grandkids, and they are demanding that as operators in the space, we are going to constantly strive to be more responsible operators. We have the renewable sector, using a reputation to facilitate their goal to transition from fossil to so-called green fuels. And that is obviously putting a lot of pressure on us to show that, no, we can be responsible operators too. We have investors who are increasingly looking to align their investment decisions with public sentiment. So there's a perfect storm that's brewing that is forcing us to truly buckle down and get a handle on our emissions footprint. Oil and gas industry leaders are increasingly realize that our license to operate depends on the trust that consumers, employees, and stakeholders place in us. And so our long-term survival depends on our ability to deliver energy assets sustainably. And that is where IoT comes in to help us achieve that goal, as you will see here today. But to illustrate some of the challenges, some of the headwinds that we're facing, I got two articles up here on the screen, and you're probably familiar with those. The first one, Engine One, taking 2 seats on the Exxon board. Engine One being an active investor, driving the Exxon board to adopt sustainable practices. And Engine 1 is now gearing up to try to convert Exxon board seats to their agenda as well. And on the other hand, you have regulatory agencies and courts forcing us to do more. You have the Dutch court ruling that Shell must step up its climate change efforts. So there's that angle there from the legislative and the judiciary. We're being forced to do more. So all of this comes together. All of this is creating that perfect storm. And how do we go about addressing it? Well, let's take a look first of all what some of the firms in the space are doing to move forward on sustainability. And a number of things are right now are revolving around setting bolder targets for net zero emissions. The most technical focus right now though is mostly around flare prevention, removing routine flaring from our operational procedures. So a lot of effort is on that one, and then there is an effort on reducing methane intensity to a certain percentage point or by a certain percentage point. And some firms are more aggressive here than others, as you can see here. There is industry efforts are going on with the formation of consortia, where participants and members can share their strategies towards carbon net zero. And then last but not least, there are technology, process, and as an organization, activities that are going on that our companies are utilizing. We have drones flying to do captures of methane footprints. We have fugitive modeling using satellite and drones. A lot of the stuff we will talk about here later on today. We have process changes are happening. And I want to particularly point out the one that I have down here where Shell is rethinking its maintenance strategy. That's something that we're going to be touching on here later a bit on how preventive maintenance can help us reduce our carbon footprint. And then last but not least, we have on the as an organization side, and the one thing I want to point out here particularly is what Chevron is doing with respect to incentivizing workforce to operate more cleanly, very much going back to what Deanna said earlier in her keynote with respect to never forgetting about the human element. Bring the humans into the game. Make sure that we bring the humans into our effort, our workforce, our team members, our stakeholders. So the key topics for today I want to cover with respect to methane management and methane reduction, estimates versus measures. Why is it actually so hard for us to even get an understanding and a footprint of our emissions profile? And then I want to talk about some IoT strategies that we might use to accelerate the road to net zero emissions. And last but not least, I want to touch on something, and I want to introduce something here to you today, which we call the carbon twin paradigm as an effective approach for you to start to get a handle on your emissions strategy. But before we do that, a quick word about Avanade. For those of you who do not know, Avanade is a joint venture between Accenture and Microsoft, bringing together Accenture's broad industry and subject matter expertise with Microsoft's unparalleled technology depth. And we were founded by Accenture and Microsoft in the year 2000. And since then, we have grown to over 40,000 people worldwide, operating in 80 locations. 46% of the global Fortune 500 companies are our clients. And energy has always been one of the core industry verticals that we've been going after. And I'm really proud for us to continue to support our energy clients on their transition to carbon net zero. But enough of that. Let's go back to the subject at hand. And I want to just start by looking at the emissions management process from the really highest level. It's a really easy three-step process. You first have to identify what emissions you have, where do they come from, what am I emitting. Once you know that, you can talk about remediation. How do I go about reducing these emissions down? And then I have a reporting step that helps me understand how my progress is going along the way, that helps me communicate my efforts and my activities to my stakeholder, might it be investors, employees, regulators, or who have you. Very simple process, but as always, the devil's in the details. If we delve a little bit deeper, we'll see that it's actually not as easy as it sounds. And that is particularly true for that first step, identification. And that's what I actually want to focus on for the rest of my talk here. So we're not going to talk about remediation here today. We're not going to talk about reporting. I want to focus really on identification. And so when you try to identify your emissions, there are really three key types of emitters that you need to consider. The first one are operational emitters. And think of operational emitters as, you go into your car, you switch on the key, engine starts up, exhaust is coming out of the exhaust pipe. That is an operational emission. It happens simply by operating our equipment. Generators produce operational emissions. Many processes in the carbon value chain produce operational emissions. The second broad group of emitter types are incidental emitters. And incidental emitters are emissions that happen when something goes wrong, when an incident happens. So those are not part of our normal operational procedures. Those are emissions that happen when something breaks down, maybe a compressor breaks down, I have a downstream pressure build up, and I need to vent to prevent an explosion. That would be an incidental emissions. And incidental emissions tend to be fairly large. And there tends to be, well, I'm not going to say they're not going to be predictable, because as we'll see later on, there actually are ways to predict and prevent incidental emissions. And then lastly, we have fugitive emitters. And fugitive emitters are mostly emitters that result from material deterioration over time. You might have a pipeline segment, two pipes connecting, a flange. You maybe have a rubber gasket that's in the middle. Over time, that rubber gets brittle. It doesn't expand anymore. Overnight, when it gets cold, the pipes, the material contracts, and then a leak emerges. As it warms up again, pipes expand, that leak might go away. So fugitive emitters are really, really tough in that you never know where they happen. You never know when they happen, because they tend to be non-continuous, and they're small. They're not huge leaks, but there are so many of them that in the cumulative, they are a huge contributor to our emissions profile. So operational, incidental, fugitive. Today, I'm mostly going to be focusing on how to get a handle on operational and incidental emitters. I've done a number of work on fugitives as well, but it's different types of approaches that we're using there, less related to IoT, so I'm not going to focus on that here today. But if you're interested in talking about fugitive emitters, drop me a line. I'm happy to talk to you about those as well. So the first question that we need to ask in terms of identifying our emissions is, what's our carbon footprint actually? And historically, emissions have been quantified using factors across the value chain, statistical models to help us estimate how much a facility or a pipeline segment or whatever have you might emit based on looking at all of these assets of similar types using macro models to identify these emissions. The problem is that you are actually not being judged, and you're not actually estimating actual performance of a physical asset. It's a statistical model that holds true if you look at all of the assets of a similar type, across the industry. But it does not necessarily help us to identify good operators, poor operators, which is really what we need to do to get a handle on our footprint. Today, many stakeholders are saying, well, that's really not enough. We don't want to accept this anymore. We want to be rewarded for doing well, and we want the people who don't do so well, we don't want to have to shoulder their cost. They need to pay for not doing so well. So we're going back to a market economy on emissions, as it were. As we go towards net zero, our stakeholders are demanding specifics that are reflective of our efforts for our facility, for our assets. And regardless, if you want to improve your carbon footprint, you got to know where to start. You cannot manage what you cannot measure. The old adage holds true. So we have to figure out a way to truly understand the carbon footprint of our individual assets. Measurement versus estimates. When I talk about carbon footprint, you can say, okay, fine, we'll measure what our carbon footprint is, or we continue estimating it. And so what are some of the pros and cons? First of all, on the measurement side, when you measure, you document actual performance. You establish an actual emissions baseline, but it's really not easy. There is no silver bullet. There is no one technology that I can bring in and saying, I'll do gizmo XYZ, and that's going to tell me exactly what's going on here at scale and continuously. There are different technologies to measure our emissions. We're going to look at them in a moment. All of them have their Achilles heels, and none of them in itself will provide a solution. On the other side of the estimates, estimates have been established and understood for a long time. They're not dependent on sensor technologies being deployed and installed and retrofitted, so it's really, really cheap to do. But as I mentioned earlier, they do not really help us understand the actual performance of our assets unless you go down routes that I'm going to be introducing here in the next few minutes. So let's talk about some IoT strategies to accelerate the road to net emissions. And the first one you might want to do is, well, IoT, sensors. So let's just put some sensors in to measure our emissions. That might be a very reasonable perspective to start from. And so there are really 4 major technologies that you can deploy to measure methane or really any type of carbon emission in the field. The first one I want to start with is satellites. Satellites are fantastic. We use satellites to very, very correctly and fine-grained determine the constituents of atmospheres of suns and stars many, many light years away. So you figure you could probably use it to figure out how much gas or how much concentration of a certain gas is in the Earth's atmosphere. And indeed you could. And people do. So companies like GHSat, for example, fly satellites that are equipped with spectrometers. They look down at the Earth, measure the energy of the sun that's getting absorbed by the atmosphere, and based on that can tell us exactly the concentration of certain gases, including methane, over a certain column of air. The problem with that approach is mostly one of temporal resolution, because you fly a satellite over, you get a snapshot in time of that column of air, and then the satellite moves on. So it's very hard for you to see what's going to happen next because the satellite's gone, or what happened just before because the satellite wasn't there yet. So temporal resolution is a problem that we're struggling with when it comes to satellites. That's going to improve as we have more and more satellites up there, but right now that is a real problem in addition to cost. Aircraft, fixed-wing aircraft mostly, are using a technology called LiDAR to shoot laser light that's specifically tuned into the air in front of them. That laser light excites certain constituents in the atmosphere, absorbing a certain portion of that light. The reflection is going to be measured, and again we know then how much of that gas is in front of us. So with aircraft and LiDAR, you can do very, very exact calculations. You can do plume shapes. It's fantastic. Problem is you're flying. It's a line of sight type activity. And again, the temporal resolution is very poor. You have to create a flight plan. You have to get the aircraft in the air. You have to fly it. So essentially, it's a discrete event. So and not only is it discrete, it's also again fairly expensive. You're looking at about $10,000 or so to do one data capture run for those. You take it one level down. You can use the same measurement approach, but using unmanned aerial systems like drones. You can reduce cost quite a bit. But there's a trade-off. Even though you reduce cost, you are also reducing geographical reach. So your reach or coverage becomes a lot smaller because drones have just such a poor endurance at this point in time when it comes to time in the air. So if you have a fixed asset, drones might be a fantastic way for you to get up in the air 2 or 3 times a day to get a snapshot of your facility. So certainly a way to go there. And then last but not least, we have IoT sensors. Those are really cheap devices that you can put ubiquitously everywhere. The biggest problem with those is that the reaction surface is very, very small, so you get a good concentration reading for a very, very small area. So if your sensor is not right there, inside the plume, you probably will not even detect it. So that's a huge problem with sensor technologies. There are some strategies to mitigate that, but it's coverage from that perspective with sensors is really tough at this point in time. So those 4 strategies for direct measurement. then leads to the question, well, can we actually economically and sustainably measure it? And the answer is depends. It depends on the emissions type, whether you're indoor versus outdoor, environmental conditions if you're outdoor, and then also, the economics. It is perfectly fine to use technologies like we just discussed, for example, like satellite or aircraft, if you want to do, a large-scale view of your value chain and how your footprint looks like. It's going to be not easy to drill down and find the equipment that potentially is the originator of a certain leak. Alternatively, obviously, we can ask, can we model it? Now here it becomes interesting, because what we could say, and we do this in many other industries, what we could say is, well, if I take a piece of equipment and I take it into controlled conditions and I run this piece of equipment, now I can measure via IoT some easy to get operational parameters such as flows, temperatures, pressures, what have you. Things that we already in many cases are measuring. And then I can, in parallel, because it's a controlled environment, use sensor technology, either chemical sensors or LiDAR, to measure the carbon footprint of that piece of equipment in that controlled environment. And I can build a model that correlates my operational parameters with my emissions. That's the idea behind carbon modeling. And if I do that, I create essentially a carbon digital twin, a carbon twin of that piece of equipment. I do this with the other pieces of equipment in my facility, in my asset, and I can then roll it up and accumulate the various carbon footprints into an overall carbon footprint of my facility. And that really is the idea behind carbon twinning. Identify and model the asset under controlled situations for short periods, and then use that model that you're creating to predict and estimate, really, your carbon emissions at any point in time, using the operational parameters that you have easily accessible. And then you can use measurement technologies such as satellite or fixed-wing aircraft with LiDAR to confirm the accuracy of your model at discrete times, and thereby determine that your model works or needs additional work. And so the goal here with this modeling is to optimize our operations to minimize the emissions while retaining operational efficiency. So it's kind of finding that balance. Now, the next question I want to ask is, can we prevent an emission in the first place? And that goes back to the incidental emissions, right? What we can ask then here is, well, if we look at a piece of equipment, if we look at an incident, if we look at all of the incidents that we had for the last X years, can we find commonalities, root causes that we can correlate back to things we can measure? And then using those measurements going forward, can we then predict an impending incident before it occurs? And that question is the question that we've been able to answer with predictive maintenance approaches for quite some time now. So yes, we can definitely do this. And so applying predictive maintenance to preventing carbon incidents before they from happening before they happen is a key strategy to ultimately eliminate incidental emissions. So you put these two things together, we have this model of the carbon twin that helps us to do two things. It helps us to constantly optimize the effectiveness, the carbon effectiveness of our assets using operational parameters. And it also allows us, by looking at the way that our equipment operates, predict incidents before they happen, dispatch maintenance before the incident leads to an unplanned release of some sort. So how might this look like? I have an example of a carbon twin here on the screen, and I want to just talk you real quick through it. And you see it's a fairly easy facility here. There's a vessel, there's a fired heater that we have there. That fire heater is lit up red. Well, the story behind this is this fired heater was designed for a certain feedstock. The feedstock over time has changed a little bit, and it's become a little bit more dirty. So what happens is the heater gunks up. As you burn this, there's less clean fuel. Condensate happens on the walls. That increases the thermal resistance of the heater. Now that's something that we can very easily measure looking at the inlet and outlet temperatures. Now because the thermal resistance increases, we have to now run the heater harder to create the same outlet temperature, which is what we need for the downstream processes. That means that the heater is then emitting more greenhouse gases. How do we know that? Well, because we know that because we've modeled that in the lab. And you can see here the operational parameters that we are capturing for that heater, and you see that the thermal resistance is in that yellow band because it started gunking up. You see that some of the other parameters are running in the yellow, and because of that, we know that our overall emissions are starting to tick up, and we can even forecast how much they're going to increase if we don't do anything. Because if we don't do anything, what will happen is that heater will keep gunking up. We'll have to run it harder and harder. We're going to emit more and more. And so there is an immediate impact then on our energy consumption, and then ultimately on our equivalent carbon emissions. And you see it's about to take off there quite a bit in that upper chart. Now, in addition to being able to forecast this impact on our CO2 equivalent emissions, we also now can make decisions and we can make recommendations on what to do to prevent this from happening. And that's one of the powers that you have with digital twinning, and therefore also with carbon twinning. We can say, well, we could replace the heater and buy a new heater that is more appropriate for that more dirty type of fuel that we have available to us right now, and that there's a certain cost associated with it. Or we could bring a backup heater online, and there's a certain cost associated with that. And each of these choices also have a certain impact on our CO2 emissions. And we can now make decisions that are based in what's best for the organization overall. Are we spending the money? Are we making the investment? Or does it make sense to maybe continue to burn hard for a while longer, while maybe another strategy comes available? Maybe we can switch the fuel source again to a cleaner fuel, whatever that might be. But we can now have actionable things that we can do in order to mitigate the increased carbon footprint that our gunked up heater produces. And that is the whole idea behind the carbon twin. And we think it's a very, very promising approach that leads us away from trying to do measurement at scale and continuously. We do not believe that measurement at scale and continuously with today's technologies is a possibility. So improved modeling using digital twin technologies and machine learning is the next best thing we have to actually measure the actual carbon performance of our assets. So how do you get started with something like that? Well, step one is create an emissions taxonomy across your entire value chain. List the emitters, figure out, are these operational emitters, incidental emitters, fugitive emitters? And then once you've done that, for each emitter, you can identify proxy parameters, proxy operational measurements that are easy to obtain, temperatures, flows, pressures, whatever that might be. And you can use those then to build a model in a controlled environment, one emitter at a time. And then you deploy it in the field, you add it all up, you get a carbon score across your entire value system. So what are some of the decision points as you kind of go down this journey? Have you created your carbon taxonomy? Whether you're going to do carbon twinning or whether you're going to do another approach that's maybe checkpoint type measurements using satellites, using airplanes, you still have to understand what your emitters are. So order your value chain to identify potential emitters, classify your emitters to develop an appropriate identification and mitigation approach for each emitter. Have you developed an integrated approach? We have a lot of pilots are going on in various companies that we're working with, but how do we bring them together? How do we create a convergent strategy that helps us ultimately give us a view of what we want, which is an overall evaluation of the carbon impact of our organization? And then last but not least, how will your enterprise engage with the wider ecosystems? Consider the impact of partners and vendors in your carbon footprint. What technologies are you bringing in? What advice, what expertise can you bring in? And also ask your equipment vendors increasingly to generate these carbon profiles, these carbon models for the equipment that you're using, so that you can leverage them, so that you don't have to build them yourself. You know, particularly if you build greenfield facilities or you do a retrofit, ask your vendors, can you provide a carbon model for us, for this piece of equipment that we're replacing, for this new facility that we're building? A couple of things in conclusion. There is no silver bullet really when it comes to trying to figure out our carbon footprint. And a comprehensive net zero strategy will need to leverage many, many different approaches and many, many different technologies to help us ultimately achieve the goal to getting to net zero. IoT enables carbon twins. It's data from IoT systems that are in many cases currently in place that we can leverage just to create a carbon model on top of the various operational models that we've already developed by investing in digital twins and in IoT. And last but not least, this is a marathon, it's not a sprint. This is not something that we're going to get done in the next 12 months. This is going to be a lot of experimentation, a lot of moving in fits and starts, moving a couple of facilities at a time, trying out things that work, making sure they do work before we scale them up at scale. And with that, I want to open it up for questions. I want to thank you for being here today and for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about the power of carbon twinning. Thank you.
I don't know what to do on the question part.
Well, it's what it is, right?
So I was like, is he gonna like wing it on the questions, or is he gonna like, I was trying to figure that out?
That's tough.